Welcome to Keeping the World Company on Think Tech Hawaii. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. Today, we'll talk about the end of Pax Americana, but what will take its place. Our co-host for the show is Tim Apicella. Our esteemed guests for the show are Gene Rosenfeld, independent scholar, and Manfred Henningsen, emeritus professor of political philosophy, Manoa. Welcome to you all. We are at a crossroad of history, and we must be alert to the sea changes in possible direction. Trump's re-ascent marks a new turnaway from the Pax Americana to an era of isolationism and libertarianism that may engage our adversaries in a way that is different. What will the ascent of this new or revisited populism do in the West? And should we also consider another rival hypothesis to the effect that the radical right in Europe and in the US are actually a resurgence of fascism in a different guise?
There definitely is a sea change underway, and we are at a crossroads. I'm not saying that as a matter of my opinion, but experts, scholars, commentators whom I try to keep up with tend to agree on that one thing, even though they disagree about what road we should take from now on or what road the Trump administration is likely to take. Three major scholars are Robert Kagan of the Brookings Institution, who has been a neoconservative scholar along with William Crystal, but a very fact-based, evidence-based, and very insightful analyst on international affairs. He and another scholar, Charles Kupchan, who's recently wrote a book on the decline of American power and the decline of the Pax Americana, is a critic of Robert Kagan, who basically has taken the position that Biden defended in his speech this week to the State Department civil servants that he addressed. You know, Biden's giving a series of speeches, valedictory speeches on his entire career, not just his presidency. And he gave a major summary of the foreign policy that he backs. And he is indeed both a follower and an architect of the Pax Americana, which refers to the 80 years since World War II, approximately, where the United States has taken leadership in the world, established institutions, international institutions, to keep peace and avoid a third world war. That particular new world order after World War II, which is now considered the old world order, may come to an end with the Biden presidency, according to other scholars such as Charles Kupchan, who is saying that Trump is right, that the Pax Americana is over, and we have an opportunity maybe in the way he deals with world affairs to ensure peace in the future and to take a new tack, mainly in the kind of transactional negotiation that he indulges in. But there is a warning too, because Trump is somewhat unregulated and unilateralism could never really take the place of the kind of international connections that the Pax Americana has put in place. So Kupchan is both wary of what may come, but also welcoming it and recognizing that, okay, American major Western influence is over. All the projections show that China will be the dominant world power by 2050, but that the United States will be number two. However, Europe is in decline and will not be among the top contenders, and we better watch out. So there is another excellent commentator, Hal Brands, who is an international specialist, and he is for repairing the Pax Americana. He's warning us that we we are heading again for a third world war, and we are in conflict right now, which I have been contending for some time, by the way, and that we need to shore up our alliances. We need to collaborate and integrate the buildup of our military defenses, because this is indeed what the new Axis powers are doing. And the new Axis powers are Russia and China's buddyship relationship, along with North Korea and Iran. They are all integrating their defense mechanisms and present a potential major challenge militarily and politically to the United States and the West.
So, Manfred, let me go to you. There is some evidence that Trump is moving to enable and support similar right-wing movements, similar to his, especially in Europe. That would allow him to become the leader, not of what we have known as the free world under Pax Americana, but of a subset of European countries, of former democracies moving to authoritarianism. And you can see what Elon Musk has been doing in Germany, in the UK, and in other countries in Europe. Is America returning to Mussolini's worldview with grievances over World War I, with institutionalized propaganda, with assignment of blame to scapegoats, with the ultra-nationalism and territorial expansion that grew out of the unresolved issues of World War I, and for that matter, World War II? Your thoughts about the implications of Trump's movement in Europe?
I had always something against invoking the ghost of Hitler, and now you invoking the ghost of Mussolini. And I do not think it's Mussolini. I don't even know whether Trump knows who Mussolini was. But I think that you're right in emphasizing these strange attempts of the Trumpists to connect with the right-wing movements in Europe, but whether it's now Le Pen in France or the AfD in Germany or Orban or the neo-fascist, but since then somewhat pragmatic party government in Italy, there is, I don't know, he doesn't like the European Union. He doesn't like many of the European policies, but on the other hand, you can also say Europe is doing a lot to encourage these attempts. There's a lot of liberalism awake in Europe, and there is not the kind of unity that you had, after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the early 90s. I mean, you could say the 90s was the decade of Europe coming into coming politically together. Not only Western Europe, the old European community, but it opened up to countries in Eastern Europe, the enlargement of the European Union. And you had the feeling, at that time that Europe was going to become a kind of positive counterpart to the United States, liberal democracy, neoliberal economy developments, and opening up within the continent, making the continent with a continent without borders. The Schengen Agreement, was signed after the fall of the wall. Initially, France and Great Britain were a little bit nervous about opening up not only their countries to the East Germans, but to other Europeans that were going to, Eastern Europeans that were going to join the European Union. But that vanished and Schengen became accepted. Schengen is today in trouble. It is still working, but it's in trouble because some countries do temporarily close their borders to asylum seekers. So in that sense, what you have in Europe, is a situation where that unity that emerged out of the collapse of the Soviet Union, and that I think is a major incision. It is not only World War II, the end of fascism. No, it's the collapse of the Soviet Union that really gave a lot of power to a lot of energy to this liberal political order that was emerging in Europe. And this order is now not only endangered by the Musks of America, Grinnell, the American ambassador to Germany, and Angela Merkel was still the chancellor, started that already, in 2000, in the first Trump presidency. So in that sense, what you have is not only the emerging of this liberal presidency in the United States, with this majority support by the people, but you have also this, this inability of the European political elites to holding this post-Soviet union together. I'm still not completely skeptical about the future, but there are danger signs that are not simply connected with the United States and what is happening here, but with what is happening in Europe itself. The meta-narrative of meaning that was emerging after the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s is not going forward.
Well, what's the meaning and effect of Elon Musk's visit with AfD and other countries, as you mentioned, in Europe?
We will see that. We will see that in Germany in February when you have the elections there on the 23rd of February. At this point, I think it simply reinforces the AfD. I don't think it adds a lot of power to it, but because you have this tendency there, a tendency that has to do with the frustration in East Germany about the unification. They feel, they have been colonized by West Germany. Now, the fascinating thing is, I just finished reading the 700 pages of Angela Merkel's memoirs called Freedom, that you had for 16 years, an East German chancellor, and you had for 5 years an East German president, Joachim Gauck. So, this complaining by some segments in East Germany about being colonized by the West. Well, Germany, the United Germany was governed for 16 years by an Aussie and had a president who was an Aussie. So I don't, buy into this kind of idiotic argument, about the discrimination of West Germany against East Germany, looking at Angela Merkel's career. It's a very interesting book. It's well written by her and her assistant Baumann, but she she admits, there were some problems when it came to integrating these two parts, but she never questioned the success story. And the interesting thing is, that she called the book Freedom because she suffered for 35 years of her life under being not free, being not able of doing what she wanted to do and where to go. And for that reason, for her, it was absolutely an exciting moment when the wall came down. And suddenly she was free, and she used this freedom in a interesting way, not simply continuing her academic career as a physicist. No, she changed. She suddenly felt so free, that she could move from science to politics.
Let's stop there.
Okay.
And go to Tim, because Tim is going to have some questions for you both.
In Trump's first term and now, the media and people provide opinions in a variety of areas. They're saying that, we're moving into more of an isolationist environment as a nation. And I'm thinking that we're becoming, as I think about Trump's words and rhetoric about Greenland, the Panama Canal, Canada, those inflammatory statements he makes, is it really isolationism, or is it more of an independent expansionism? And I'm thinking back in history, back into the late 1890s of President McKinley and President Teddy Roosevelt, that has an expansionist desire and that easily propelled us into the Spanish-American War, where we took Cuba, we took Guam, the Philippines, to some extent later, Hawaiian Islands. And the question is, are we independently striving to go into an expansionist mode like Putin? Or are we truly becoming isolationists and we don't care what's happening anywhere except for what's happening in the United States? Jean, I guess to you.
Yes, we are going into isolationism and expansionism at the same time, into the signs and symbols of the MAGA Trump movement. And what's interesting, and the reason why I stick to my thesis that this is fascism again, fascism reworked, is that in my reading of the analysis of how Mussolini came to power in particular, and how Hitler consolidated power after he became chancellor, the parallels are striking to what's going on today. And the question really is, will the center hold? And by that, and that's W.B. Yeats' famous poem, by that, I mean, will the three-legged stool of American unique Republican democracy be able to defend the institutions that we were founded upon against a tribe of people headed up by shamans, among others, and Steve Bannon also. And now we have Elon Musk as a rogue, and Vivek Ramaswamy being given the keys to the kingdom to dismantle against their expressed desires over many, many years to dismantle the United States government and to create an autocracy where uniformity of practice and policy and opinion is cobbled together by a gang of people at the top, much as Putin has done, and much more specifically as Viktor Orban has done in Hungary. Viktor Orban has waged an assault on the rule of law in Hungary that has consolidated power in the executive branch. This is precisely what Trump is copying right now. Mm-hmm. And we watch it as we see these hearings going on in the Senate for the confirmation of these individuals that he has nominated with absolutely no expertise or knowledge or experience any way comparable to those that have headed up our absolutely magnificent civil service for the past 100 years in the United States. Now, maybe by putting together a cabinet of these rogues, He will create a team of rivals that will devour each other, because already Steve Bannon and Elon Musk are going at it. We don't know that. In any event, he thinks he can control, he can be the puppet master, and he can translate his impulses and his biases into a policy that will be carried out by individuals who have kissed his ring and pledged their fealty. But what we are facing is unprecedented in American history. And remember, the United States is still the leader, the world leader, in terms of expressing our values and our political system throughout the world. And the very reason why we are being challenged today by countries that are developing greatly, like India and Brazil and Turkey, is because we have, in essence, given the world something since World War II, which is how to rationally and practically develop so that your peoples can thrive. I mean, China owes a great deal more to the détente with the United States than it does to Mao Zedong, almost, in terms of its economic development and policies. I mean, it's a hybrid state. It is using authoritarian means to control a population, but at the same time rewarding that population with a degree of prosperity and longevity China has never enjoyed throughout its entire history.
Let me get to Greenland for a second, if I may. Is Donald Trump picking a fight with Denmark over Greenland as some faux way or fake way to come up with a reason why the United States should exit NATO?
It's an example of the expansionism that paradoxically is taking place with the isolationism. Greenland and his comments on Greenland stand as a symbol, a shocking symbol, of how he wants to aggrandize territory and influence to the United States, because Greenland has untapped natural resources beneath the sea and beneath the land. And he's looked at a Mercator projection map and seen how huge Greenland is. Actually, it's much smaller than that. It is the biggest island in the world, but it's nowhere near continent size. Nevertheless, it's untapped. And he knows also politically that the people of Greenland who live there are being given more autonomy over their own futures by Denmark, which technically owns Greenland. So that's an expansionism. Also, expansionism in financial control over Canada and Mexico. It is expanding the North American continent. And in the Panama Canal, he wants to, in essence, counter Chinese control over a waterway and to regain the profit from that waterway that unites North and South America. So he's on steroids with the Monroe Doctrine right now and expanding into Greenland. And at the same time, he's saying, we don't have to worry about Russia and China because we're protected by two oceans, when everybody knows that has no meaning in this age of technological communication and transportation and warfare. So he has this combination expansionism that he wants, in essence, to pose an American double continent over and against the Eurasian continent, which one of the scholars I mentioned earlier calls the center of the world demographically and geographically, which is true. But he wants to in essence, challenge the other hegemons that are challenging American power in a kind of a personal duel, if you will.
It's kind of hypocritical to look at it from the point of view of, isolationism, and at the same time have all these people going out on his behalf to try to expand his power elsewhere. So which is it? The two are inconsistent. And I really wonder what his constituents feel about that. In any event, we started out with a discussion of Trump enabling right-wing movements, not only in this country, but also in Europe. And this would ultimately allow him to become the leader, not of the free world we have known under Pax Americana, but of former democracies in Europe that are moving right to authoritarianism. And one of the interesting pieces, and this comes from a discussion by Anne Applebaum, is if you move right, and there have been many examples of this in Europe, and you move to authoritarianism, it undermines your economy. Hungary is one of the poorest countries in Europe. It wasn't always thus, but Viktor Orban, in moving to the right, has undermined its economy. And so when you see Trump trying to become the leader of these former democracies, you have to wonder where that takes those countries and where it takes Europe in general economically. And so one of the things we've heard, and Manfred, you could probably address this, is that Europe's economy in general is not doing well. And maybe that's because of the move right. And will there be further problems economically when Trump gets his hooks into these countries, such as Germany, France, Italy, where Elon Musk is a busy fellow running around trying to sell a conservatism in all those countries? So, Manfred, how is the economy doing in Europe in general, not just Germany, but everywhere? And what's the connection between the move right and the economies of these various countries, including the countries that are moving to the right?
The European economies, the two major ones, France and Germany, are certainly not in decline, but they're in trouble. I think both of them will return to normal, their normal health within maybe even this year.
What's your evidence on that, Manfred?
Well, because of internal developments that are taking place. Look, Germany is dependent on exports, has been exports for a long, long time. And they're in the process of restructuring. Angela Merkel, as well as Scholz now, have avoided dealing with that. But I think that is radically changing. So for that reason, don't count out the German economy or the French economy.
Let's go to the question of the integrity, the cohesive quality that we have described in the 90s. That special bond between the Western European countries and the EU, and for that matter, NATO. Do you feel that what's happening here, the identification of these right-wing movements and Trump's efforts to support them, encourage them with Elon Musk and otherwise, does that help the EU, or does that undermine the EU? Does that help NATO, or does it undermine future collective security under NATO? Manfred?
It certainly doesn't help. But on the other hand, you have to remember, you have Putin's Russia being there as a threat. This is not a threat that the United States feels, but it's a threat that European countries feel in the north, in the northern part of the continent, but in Germany as well. Now, you have then, on the other hand, this anti-American attitude of the right that you have not talked about at all. The anti-American attitudes that you have in most of these right-wing parties in Germany, in Europe, not only in Germany, in Europe, they are all Putin-friendly. So you have their, the counter imperialism being supported by right-wing parties in Europe. The Russian imperialism. I mean, you have two imperialist tendencies, the American that Tim was talking about and the Russian. And Europe finds itself in a way in the middle of between these two. Now, the
Maybe Tim has a question about that, because if Trump is trying to curry favor with these right-wing movements in Europe, how does that comport with the essential anti-American feeling that you're talking about? Tim, do you want to pursue that?
Well, I'll go to previous things that Manfred has mentioned, and that is, just because they're a conservative party does not mean the entire concept is evil. In this country, we know that many Democrats support immigration reform, which has been identified as a conservative concept, but it's adopted and been accepted by both the Democrats and the Republicans, and certainly the MAGA movement. But so when we say conservative movement, do we talk about the specific issues of that movement? Is it immigration and clamping down on immigration? Or is it the movement of authoritarianism? I mean, is that part of the conservative movement or not? So, I mean, it comes down to semantics, I think, sometimes we have to be careful of. And that's the question to Manfred is, are we dealing with semantics when we talk about conservative movements in Europe and the United States? Or is there much to do about nothing?
If you talk about conservative movements, that's different than right-wing movements. The right-wing movements are not the conservative movements in Europe. So in Germany, the conservative part is represented by Angela Merkel's party, the Christian Democrats. And you have similar, parties in all other Western European countries. So for that reason, I think we have to be careful comparing political movements in Europe and in the United States. There's not a direct overlap. But I think what the Trumpists so far do not understand is the sympathy of some of these right-wing parties with Putin. And this, a connection between the right-wing European parties and Putin is quite, it's different from what we are always looking at when we are talking about the United States. Now, there's one other thing that I wanted to emphasize, also with regard to Gene's comments. You are always talking about the end of World War II, the end of the threat of fascism. I think in Europe, the incision is the collapse of the Soviet Union. It is much more politically, has been much more politically influential during the founding process of the European Union. The European Union is a result also of the collapse of the Soviet Union. That's when the European community, economic community, becomes the European Union. And you have to understand that the impact of the collapse of the Soviet Union was a liberating influence all over Europe. Now, whether Putin has succeeded in somehow conquering the fear of Russia, I don't know. I'm not living there. I don't see that. I don't know enough about the reactions that you have in all European countries with regard to that. But it's not, the threat of Russia has to do with, a memory also of the threat of the Soviet Union.
Let's move to Jane to try to get some clarity on all this. Jane, we started out with these two separate hypotheses. Can you restate those hypotheses and tell us your view of which one is more likely based on your reading? And try to give us a handle on how these various dynamics are affecting Europe and the U.S., and the connection between Europe and the U.S. in this time of the decline or demise of Pax Americana?
Well, first of all, I'm not accepting the thesis that the Pax Americana is in decline. Even Kupchan, Charles Kupchan, the scholar I mentioned, who questions the Pax Americana, who says it is in decline, that Trump is right when he says it's over. That's what Trump has said. Of course, Trump always exaggerates, but that Kupchan says, yeah, well, it is. But I question that, because even Kupchan gives us statistics on how the United States is still superior economically, financially, and politically in the world. And he says it's not going to decline relative to the way Europe, he thinks, will decline. But on the other hand, we're in alliance. We still have NATO. NATO is a very strong alliance, and it is the one thing that Putin most targets, because he's afraid of NATO, because it unites the European continent, because he can't divide and conquer. He can't even use the sabotage and arsons and bombings and assassinations he's conducting right now as a shadow war in Europe to separate those countries one from another. Yeah, there are squabbles. There are always squabbles. But I mean, there's squabbles among neighbors, okay? Relatively speaking. So, first of all, there is definitely an alliance between the United States and Europe that is healthy and that is withstanding itself despite the challenges posed by a resurgent regime in Russia, which really, if you look at the studies of authoritarianism, they do not make a big distinction between the Soviet Union and the fascist powers. Yes, they were enemies, but they strategically had agreements in order to take over other countries at other times. And Putin is deliberately using the pattern of the takeover of Lithuania by Stalin in his war against Ukraine. He is an unreconstructed Russian fascist. And that is why we are looking at a world that is re-examining the fascist thesis. I'm not saying the same things are happening that happened before World War II. There is definitely a pattern, and scholars of fascism have elucidated that pattern, and that pattern is repeating itself today in the rise of the United States political crossroads between the takeover of the conservative GOP by a movement, a charismatic movement led by a charismatic leader, to change the foreign policy and stance of the United States and both expand our influence beyond what the Russians have deliriously called imperialism to the status of a rival to the kind of imperial policies and fascist policies of Putin.
Just to wrap this up, Trump is making certain moves, developing certain international policies that are inconsistent with his isolationism, and he's trying to have an effect on Europe. And my question is, he's going to take office on Monday. What effect is he going to have? None, some, a little, a lot, now, later? What effect is he going to have? We know, that the status quo, the liberal world order, is under attack. And there were those, including Putin, who'd like to change it all around. What effect will Trump have on that?
Well, we don't know the future, and we don't know what the pushback will be. But the signs are not promising. He is assembling a team of people who basically agree with his policy, and the 49% of people who voted in the United States, which is not 50% of the adults in the United States even, would prefer, which is we want no foreign entanglements, no foreign wars. All the money we spent on addressing climate change and instability and famines and wars. We want to come home to the United States to enrich those that were left behind by globalization and the outsourcing of our industries and the loss of our steel industry and our car industry, and come home to the United States and build up domestic power so that we can all enjoy domestic prosperity, even though we all have to basically take the same point of view that this movement is taking. And this movement actually reaches down into the personal lives of human beings and tells them, what they're going to do in their bedrooms.
Tim, why don't you close on this and try to make some summary of it? What have we been talking and pushing in the various positions that have been taken? And where do you think we are going with respect to the main question of how Trump's moves are going to affect Pax Americana, not only in the U.S., but elsewhere?
Well, I think it comes down to, like all things in this world, it comes down to money. Follow the money. There's an old saying that business goes where business is welcomed. And when you deal with the difference between a democracy and an autocracy, where you have capitalist movements, the free markets versus restrictive communist markets, money tends to gravitate to those economies where it's a free and fair market, more or less free and fair. I think of our stock market, very strong. I think of the bond market, extremely strong. I think of the US dollar, extremely strong. I think of our economic output of GDP, very strong. The world is investing in the United States because it knows it can depend on the good faith credit of the United States. When I want to pay $1 billion for treasury bonds, I know at maturity, I'm going to get that $1 billion back plus interest. And there's no worry about it. But if I have to go to other nations where there's an autocracy, hey, it's anyone's guess whether my investment survives or not. And for my sample example is, look at Cuba and all the investments that took place in Cuba that were nationalized, and all that money was lost. So I'm just saying, when it comes to Pax Americana, follow the money, because money will gravitate to those countries where they know the money is safe and the investment is safe. And when you have safe investments, safe dollars, you have a more stable democracy, or the political structure is more sound. But with an autocracy, dictatorship, fascism, you don't know which way the wind's going to blow, and your money is at far greater risk.
Okay. Thank you, Tim. Very interesting comments from all of you, Tim Apicella, and our esteemed guests, Gene Rosenfeld and Manfred Henningsen. Thank you so much to all of you. I'm your host, Jay Fidell. Thanks to our viewers and listeners for watching and listening. Aloha.